Well, it's Wednesday morning and welcome to our devotion again this morning. This morning we're going to continue to read from the book of Acts. We're looking at Acts chapter 16 and verses 1 to 5. Paul came to Derbe and then to Lystra, where a disciple named Timothy lived, whose mother was Jewish and a believer, but whose father was a Greek. The believers at Lystra and Iconium spoke well of him. Paul wanted to take him along on the journey, so he had him circumcised because of the Jews who lived in that area, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. As they travelled from town to town, they delivered the decisions reached by the apostles and elders in Jerusalem for the people to obey. So the churches were strengthened in the faith and grew daily in numbers. In verse 1 here, we find that Paul and Silas have begun that process of revisiting some of the congregations that have been established during that first missionary journey by Barnabas and Paul. And they'd set out, if you remembered, from Antioch and travelled around these areas, and they're doing the same again. Paul, first of all, together with Silas, revisits Derbe, where they've won a large number of disciples. Then on to Lystra, where the lame man has been healed, which led, if you remember, to that terrible moment when Paul and Barnabas had been declared gods. And the crowd had gathered, and how the Jews had stirred the crowd up, and Paul had nearly come to his end when he was stoned, and then he made this miraculous recovery. Clearly, as we have said, when we look at this passage, we see that the gospel had hit home, and congregations had been established in all of those places that they had visited. It was now time to go and to see how they were getting along. Among the first believers that we're told here about was Timothy's family. Eunice, of course, was his mother. In 2 Timothy 1 and verse 5, we find that he also had a believing grandmother. At this point, we assume that his father was dead. Timothy was a child of a mixed marriage, which was clearly unusual at that time. His mother was a Jew, his father was Greek. But more than that, Timothy had already impressed many of the elders in the churches. They could see great potential in this young man. And Paul, quite naturally, is very keen to get him onto the team. And then in verse 3, we find something that, if you pause and think about it, is seemingly quite incredible. Paul, we're told, has Timothy circumcised. Well, why is this incredible? Well, of course, it's Paul that has stood against the necessity of circumcision for Gentile believers. It's Paul who's been caught up with having disagreements with Peter and Barnabas over the issue of compromise. Now he's circumcising Timothy at the same time. Verse 4 tells us that they carry this letter from the church in Jerusalem, which gives them the right of access into the church for all non-Jews without having to be circumcised. So the question is, what are you up to, Paul? Paul has established an important principle. Salvation does not depend on circumcision. But now he does something which shows us that at certain times, in certain circumstances, for the sake of the gospel, you have to make some concessions. Concessions for the weakness of others. It's not that they're right. It's not that you're wrong. is just simply to enable you to reach them sometimes requires a concession or two to be made. By having Timothy circumcised, what Paul is doing is he's making Timothy more effective in his work amongst the Jews in this particular area. And I think that's something that Paul practiced throughout his ministry. In 1 Corinthians 9, we find that Paul is dealing there with the issue of meat that has been previously used in the sacrifice to idols. And even though Paul knows that there's nothing wrong with the meat, it's just meat, and the idols are not gods, they're nothing. Even though Paul knows that to be true, there are times when Paul says it wouldn't be right to eat that meat, particularly if it causes someone of a weaker conscience to go into a place of falling away. Paul's maxim in these situations is always, for the sake of others, I sometimes have to be abandoned. And of course, what we see here is that the outcome of having Timothy circumcised is it really strengthens the churches. It really strengthens the churches. I think we know that in coming to Jesus, we're brought into freedom. But of course, it's not freedom to simply do what we want, to ignore the feelings of others. It's a freedom to grow and to flourish without being held back by legalism or negativism. But the freedom that we enjoy in Jesus is never a freedom that allows us to cause anyone else to trip up. Whilst we might feel very comfortable doing certain things, others might not. That shouldn't stop us, of course, from doing the right thing, but we need to think about it carefully. We need to act wisely and support those who struggle with it. And sometimes that means we have to forgo something for the benefit of someone else. I wonder, as we think about that this morning, that for the sake of reaching out to someone, we might just need to let go of something that we feel quite strongly about. But at the moment, it could well prove to be a hindrance to our ability to reach that person. If it does, and if we act wisely, then maybe we can forego it for that time as we seek to reach out to someone else.
God of justice, Savior to all, came to rescue the weak and the poor, chose to serve and not to be served.